Hello and welcome to the first episode of Conversations That Change. I'm your host, Maya Valentine, and today's conversation is centered around youth activism. In America's long and expansive history, activism has played a role in social change. We can look back in our history and identify the powerful voices of the Little Rock Nine high school students who challenged racial segregation in public schools. We can examine the presence of young people during the anti-war movement, where many youth advocated for the end of the Vietnam War, and more recently, how young people have been involved in activism around climate change, social inequality, and immigration. Today, we will be further unpacking how the youth get involved in our society. I am joined with UMass Boston scholar and activist, Andrew King. Thank you so much for joining me today. So we're gonna talk a bit about youth activism, but first I want you to explain a little bit about who you are. You were born in Cambridge, raised in Cambridge. So why don't you elaborate a bit about your background?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Drew King. I grew up right around the corner, right in Central Square. This place has changed a lot in the last 10, 20 years. I came up in Area 4 neighborhood. It's one of the more low-income and working class diverse parts of Cambridge. It's between Harvard and MIT, so it's this unique space. So I grew up with folks in the Cambridge public schools from all different racial and economic backgrounds, white, black, Haitian, Jamaican, Ethiopian. Cambridge has some incredibly diverse communities. It's gentrifying now, as everybody knows, but there's also a lot of large public housing community in Cambridge. So that's one of the reasons the school system is able to stay diverse. So I went to the Sandra Graham and Rosa Parks Elementary School, named after those two great revolutionary women. And those relationships I formed in this Cambridge, or at least in that Cambridge, really shaped my world outlook and my social justice values. And, us young people were able to create bridges in ways that really transformed our lives. And I maintain a lot of those relationships today with the whole network of young people from Cambridge. I can't forget to mention my parents. I am who I am today because of them. So political organizing was always a sacred tradition in my family. And my folks have been involved in housing struggles for affordable housing, rent control back in the day in Cambridge, the fight to protect public schools and quality education. My mother, was supportive of the welfare rights movement and homeless rights movement for years in the 90s. So I grew up around that. The activist baby, be at the meetings. My house would be full of folks who are fighting the good fight. And yeah, I don't know if I can stop there. I can ramble on and on.
No, that was great. And now you are at UMass Boston?
That's right.
Yeah.
I did some time out in Philly and New York.
Yeah.
And now I'm back.
Now you're back.
Back home, UMass Boston, in this doctoral program.
Do you want to explain a little bit about the work you're doing as a PhD candidate at UMass Boston?
Sure. So I'm at the McCormick School of Public Policy. I have a great advisor, Mark Warren, who's a trained sociologist. He was trained at Harvard, but he does a lot of work with community organizers, and he's written books on community organizing. So I got very lucky to get placed with Mark. And I've been doing research on youth organizing and on the school-to-prison pipeline. Again, I don't know how much details you want. The big project we worked on was a community-based research project with the leaders of the Boston Public School walkout movement. In March 2016, 4,000 Boston students walked out of schools to protest the mayor's budget cuts. So we had a very we partnered with community organizations like the Boston Youth Organizing Project and Youth on Board, and we interviewed the leaders across the city of this walkout movement.
That's amazing.
We did in-depth interviews, and we did 3 focus groups in the schools to understand the young people's leadership how they rose as these organic core leaders of this movement. So it was very interesting, like, sociological, like youth participation and social movements.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was real cool. I sent you the report. You gotta check out our report.
Yeah, no, for sure.
And now, now we're trying to make it suitable for one of these academic journals, which is interesting.
Wow.
Journey on its own, but we're trying to publish a paper out of it. We did a public report. But.
Yeah. So, speaking about like the walkouts, that was pretty powerful to like just witness.
Right.
On my own. What is impressive about youth, especially stepping up and speaking out into really major conversations? Because I think that, sometimes it's hard to understand a like complex social issue, right? We can look at like gun control, for example. Like sometimes I get stuck on like trying to comprehend like just how vast that can be, that whole topic. But it seems like a lot of young people are so willing to stand up for a cause.
Right.
And maybe it's not, that simple, but it's present and they do. So what is impressive and important about that?
Yeah, well, it's very impressive, and then it's even ironic that we then neglect their voices and marginalize their voices and don't listen to, I'm saying society in general, and adults and our political establishment. So absolutely, I think young people throughout history have always been at the forefront of all major social movements, right?
Yeah.
You look at all movements, civil rights movement, Black Power, the women's movement, the Latinx movements, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street. It's always young people at the vanguard.
Yeah.
And we have to take note of that and learn that and draw those lessons. Absolutely. So with the walkout, we found that youth really, like, they claimed leadership of this movement, and they knew they had to protect the reputation of their movement because the whole city establishment said, it's the teachers union behind this. It's the adult pulling the strings behind these young people. They're puppets. But no, we found that young people orchestrated this whole thing all on their own. They distributed leadership across the schools. They conceptualized leadership as very collective in nature and horizontal, right, rather than center and hierarchical power. They shared we found that the veteran youth organizers, they call themselves veterans, who had training the older students. They helped the younger people identify the issues. They educated them on the cuts, recruited them into the movement, gave them their spaces, trained them, and really thought of leadership as a supportive role and trained all this new cadre. And now you have, you had one organizer, and now there's a bunch of freshmen and sophomores who become organized in that school. Now they're going off and these are high schools across the city. Yeah. So they spread these leadership opportunities. And now you have a new youth organizer. She sees her friend gets profiled at the medical detectors, and she's protesting that. She's organizing action around that. So it really, their leadership and enthusiasm spreads like wildfire. So
yeah. No,
I'm sure we'll come back to these themes.
For sure, yeah.
Right.
Actually, I know you kind of were hinting at this, but why should we be paying attention to these voices in particular?
Right. I think, again, youth are at the center. I think they have insights and intuition that a lot of the older generations don't have or don't see. And I think it's just so important for us to facilitate, support their leadership and their voice. We can be critically supportive. It doesn't mean you gotta just be worried about pandering to them or be super politically correct and not ever critique their music or all that. I mean, I love the 90s hip hop.
Yeah.
And I like a J. Cole more than a Little Pump. And I am pessimistic about some of the trap music, but we won't go there.
No, not today.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry, it's a broad question, so
right,
I'll try to target my answer for you.
Why should we be listening and paying attention and recognizing that it's young people who are stepping up? Maybe not like people in positions of power or, you know, like an older generation. It's young people. And we're going to like, you know, inherit like the world in some ways eventually.
Right.
So I guess where I'm kind of going at with this question is like, why is it important that we're
Yeah.
listening now?
Well, I think young people, and especially marginalized youth of color and youth from oppressed communities, are at this. There's a war against them. Absolutely, there's a war that we've seen in the last 30 years with mass incarceration,
Right.
with criminalization.
Right.
We see all the black youth getting shot down in the streets, and like I said, we gotta learn from history. Young people are always at the forefront of social movements that benefit everybody.
Yeah.
So we want to transform this society and you know, and attack all these interlocking systems of oppression, whether it's institutional racism, patriarchy, corporate power, and class inequality. Youth are really the center of this. And I think if you look at like the school to prison pipeline,
Right.
that's it right there. And these young people know what time it is. They're making the connections. They understand institutional racism, structural racism. They understand how patriarchy works, and they know that we have to combat poverty. And we saw this in the research. I mean, these young people were phenomenal, just brilliant, so diverse and multiracial. Like they got it better than the older left, which is much more segregated, just old. The older generation, but I mean, this group is just like this: women in leadership, is Latina, black, white, all working together. You know, they have their analysis down, very militant. They're not backing down. You know, I'll tell you, in Cambridge, I was supporting Cambridge Black Lives Matter. I had never done a direct action of being arrested before, and it was two young black women comrades who are still at Ringe. Shout out to Mary and Emanuela, who, you know, planned, orchestrated a whole direct action at City Hall. I don't know if you guys saw it in the paper, almost 2 years ago, protesting for more affordable housing in Cambridge and how all the communities of color are being displaced and pushed out by overdevelopment. Anyways, long story short, and they got me into my first direct action, and we all got arrested together.
Wow.
And that was a powerful experience. But if it weren't for these young women's leadership,
Yeah.
I wouldn't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They pushed me to get more skin in the game.
Can you like maybe speak
tell
more
me
to
more.
how like
Oh, man.
profound that
was-
experience was?
That was a whole adventure.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I had just been,
You were arrested.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, it was the whole thing. We locked down to City Hall doors 6 a.m.
Yeah.
We had to wake up super early, go out there. I don't think I slept a wink the night before. I don't know if
Wow.
anybody did. We locked down. We were there for like 8 hours. The cops just let us lie there.
What was like? What did you see change, or what was like the community response maybe?
Right. So I'll just say first, it's the leadership and the camaraderie from these young women was amazing.
Yeah.
And like you had to have like a team captain, because you got to make game time decisions when you're doing some action like that. So you know one of the young women comrades was the team captain. I just totally just trusted her. Right. I mean, it's easier for me. I just had to take the arrest, but I mean,
Sure,
she planned
yeah.
the whole thing. And eventually we met one of our policy goals.
Wow.
Which was just to raise the percentage that the big developers, it had to be like 20 or 25% affordable units
That's
for new
amazing.
development. So that was one of the demands. And I think 6 months later, I think they implemented that.
That's great.
I should be more on top of it. You know, you get pulled into other projects.
Right.
But that was a transformative experience.
I
and
bet,
it was very
yeah.
interpersonal and direct, and working with other Cambridge youth.
Yeah. I want to go back. You mentioned how like the youth can understand and like conceptualize this idea of like oppression, like the patriarchy, things like, you know, racial discrimination and inequality. So it makes me think like activism in this country or like globally isn't new. It's not something that, you know, we should be surprised about when people speak out and young people speak out.
Mm-hmm.
But in a lot of ways today, especially, it seems like we're witnessing new forms of activism. And we've, you know, you can look back at our history for sure and like identify key points in time where people, you know, mobilized and stood up for a cause. We've been talking about like racial discrimination for years. So what is, I guess, different about today's youth and how they bring these conversations to like the forefront and maybe yesterday's? Or is there a difference? Are we having like the same conversations?
Absolutely, that's important.
Yeah.
I think there are political, ideological, and technological differences. Mm-hmm. Social media, well, I'm going to get into that after.
I have a question about that later.
I bet you do. I'm going to ask how tech savvy or not I am. So that great slogan goes for Movement for Black Lives, this is not your mommy and daddy's civil rights movement, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of young people and leaders of this new wave of the Black freedom movement are putting the most marginalized at the center. So, you know, some of the three of the key leaders, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors from the beginning has said, we are rejecting the respectability politics of the civil rights movement and just having men at the center, Black men at the center of the civil rights movement, and say we're going to have our queer sisters and women as the face of this movement, and we're going to you see the Say Her Name campaign. Mm-hmm. So we're going to name when there's Black women victims of police violence, and not just center Black men victims. Of course, we want to eradicate all police violence.
Right.
But I think that's just been a key trend that a lot of people are learning from and learning about. And that goes with the intersectional analysis.
Right.
And these intersecting systems of oppression. So I had more to say on that piece, so I'm blanking. And then, of course, I mean, these young people, they can harness technology in ways that, I could never have imagined.
True.
I mean, I'm not that much older. I think I'm still a youth in a way.
Right.
Early 30s. And it can be a key tool, I think, for liberation and movement building, the technology, the hashtag activism. I have my critiques too. I think everything comes with contradictions. I think it's also very addictive, just some of the social media. That a lot of it's not about social change, but they're using it obviously within these political avenues.
Right. I think that especially in relation to police brutality, social media has been really exposing like the severity of it. Because I think that when I talk to some of my peers or like my uncle, for example, it's not like who's older. He's not. If you were to say, the police disproportionately target Black men, he'd be like, well, of course, like he lived through that. He goes, as a Black man, he's aware of that. Mm-hmm. But maybe that was something, maybe it's at a scale that most people didn't recognize, and social media has brought that to like display. So that's a powerful way for sure that, technology has been.
I read this piece too that just said, the technology is just a channel for so many marginalized voices and young people who would never even get their opinions out there. Right now, get it out there into the social media network.
I totally.
That's interesting, right? So.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. You mentioned intersectionality, and I have a question about that too. So an argument was made about the Women's March, which happened earlier in the spring, I believe, that it wasn't intersectional because it was a display of white feminism. Right. And I think that if you're going to be an activist, you have to be aware of like what the cause you're standing for has so many different layers to it. And I wonder if being intersectional in the way that you think is important for effective activism.
Yeah, of course it is. I would say so. And yeah, historically that's been an issue, right, with the feminist movement.
Right.
But then obviously there have been huge waves, important waves of Black feminism and womanism. If you look at a long history there. The same thing happened with the March for Our Lives. Mm-hmm. So I don't know as well. I wasn't part of those conversations. I just can observe from social media, various trends and debates going on. So I think some of the leaders that I had known or been working with were saying, okay, the March for Our Lives, we were talking about these mass shootings in white suburbs. But they said, they say black and brown kids are dropping every day in the neglected corners of America through systemic racism, poverty, and where institutionalized violence is an everyday affair. So are we talking about that? Or are we just going to, when it happens at a white high school? I think coalitions are important. I think we need a united front. So with an understanding of intersectionality, but it's also easy for everyone just to close ranks and only just deal with their own sort of self-confirming group, saying, "Oh, we're the most woke," and there is some trends of that, which I think we got to be careful as well, because you need to move millions if we're going to win and change this system and really transform this society for young people and for all people. So you got to keep, you're right, you got to keep having those tough conversations. We got to keep building at the intersections, but we also got to build numbers and show solidarity.
Right.
So that's an important concept.
That's very true. So, another question I have here is, I've been thinking about like the idea of like sacrifice. So when I think of social justice like icons, the first person to come to my mind always is Martin Luther King. And I also think about like the threats that he had against him and his family. And if we need to, or if, in your opinion, do we need to be able to like confront like the threat? And I don't mean like it's extreme as before, but do you have to be willing to like sacrifice something, like maybe it's your comfortability, in order to like make a change?
Yeah, I think that I think the comfortability piece is more obvious.
Right.
It should be about sacrifice. It's different when you're talking about sacrificing lives or leaders' lives. I mean, that's it's higher stakes. But yeah, I think we need to be willing to take risks. This is a nuanced and tough conversation, because it's also, there's another conversation which is important though, which is about building safe spaces. For people who are facing various forms of oppression. But I think you need both. I think you got to be willing to take risks and just have raw, authentic human interactions and experiences. Again, as I'm telling you, a lot of people just think, oh, I'm the most politically correct, I'm the most woke, I do the most Twitter posts, I'm not going to engage with anyone I don't get along with. And that's not what organizing is about. You're not going to build a real social movement. I'm not saying you have to accommodate views of hate. I'm not talking about these debates around the campuses, and that's another conversation.
That is another conversation.
But I don't know. I just hear all these different things. I also hear youth organizers say, well, at the end of the day, a revolution is not a safe space. Look what Malcolm and Martin folks did.
Sure.
But of course, within movements, and if we want to build those coalitions, you got to have safe spaces and respect people. What
is like the most important thing that you've learned as being an activist or being a scholar or working with youth, organizing? What do you think is the most important thing?
That's an easy question.
Yeah.
No, I'm being sarcastic. The most important thing. I mean, I think this is not necessarily answering your question directly, but I'm just thinking out loud.
Sure.
I think we want to center youth leadership and youth of color. Of course, we also need an intergenerational movement. We need a movement that draws in everybody and sort of isolates the enemy and the powers that be if we really want to make political change. I think most important thing, that's a tough question. Do you have another question you can give me before that?
Do I have another question?
Just let the conversation flow.
Maybe if you want to think about it some more, maybe you can talk. I mean, I know we talked about like the positive effects of social media, but are there any like adverse, effects that you could think of? Could it be harmful? Maybe.
Yeah, well, sure. I'm sure there's a lot of research on this, but I think there's all types of screen addictions now, and I think it's changing the nature of how our generation, or even the generation that's a little younger than us, is relating. You know, you hear this critique
Okay.
of, I mean, how they're interacting with each other. Can they
Right.
have deep conversations without every few minutes, you know, being on your phone or on your social media?
That's true.
So with everything, though, right, there's contradictions, but I think it can be used as a tool for good, as we've seen
Yeah.
in Black Lives Matter and so many social movements. And then in terms of, you said
The most important thing.
most important thing.
Yeah, or just like any
Right,
major
right, right.
lesson. Yeah.
I would say to just be able to trust and support the youth leaders agency, and be able to listen and support. Everyone wants to be the center of attention, and there's a lot of egos get in the way,
Yeah.
especially with adults, as they say. They talk about adultism, these habitual patterns of trying to control, even if it's in a social justice space. But the young people, like we said, are at the forefront of the movement, and that's how it benefits all of us. Folks who are fighting on these issues of public education, anti-poverty, racial justice. The youth go out and do it. They rose up, and they rose up in Ferguson. They rose up in the streets of Baltimore, and they rose up here in the Boston public schools. So allowing those spaces and giving those supports, and that's how a historical process of change will run its natural course.
Thank you so much for joining me today. That's all the questions I have, but we're
Thank you
also
so much
running
for
low on
having
time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
This is
of course.
exciting.
No, this was great. This was great.
I'm honored that I was invited.
That's it for our show today. I want to thank Andrew for participating in this episode of Conversations That Change. We'll see you next time.